Thanks very much, Englandia. The way I hope this call can go, since you guys have all joined, is for it to be more of a conversation, a debate, and a way for us to build up our community view, our collective view on Sovryn platform and Sovryn as a layer for Bitcoin. So I will look to provide the following agenda. The agenda might be fluid based on where the conversation flows, but to provide us with some structure, what I'm suggesting is as follows. First, I'd like to provide some brief context, which I think will be valuable to get us all set on the same page. Then I think it would be worth talking about paths forward now versus the immediate term versus the medium term versus the long term. Then we can talk about execution, and that can also include architecture and capital. So in terms of context, the overall plan, to the extent that Sovryn has a plan, is ambitious but also quite simple, and I think we can break it down into 3 stages. In stage 1, the idea is, and was, build the leading ecosystem for Bitcoin native DeFi tools. Use this to unlock the value that Bitcoin has without the need for centralized intermediaries. And then, using these tools, using the traction, the early community, and the value driven by this, move on to stage 2. Where stage 2 is build a scalable protocol for trustless smart contract rollups on Bitcoin. We've described it as rollups, but ideally, and the ultimate goal is to build trustless smart contracts and trustless rollups for Bitcoin, which effectively would allow you to build anything on Bitcoin without having to impact main chain. And if we can accomplish this in combination with a growing DeFi ecosystem, we can move on to stage 3, where stage 3 is build a world on Bitcoin. And so that's building a true alternative to today's centralized economic, corporate, and state interests. It means building a true ecosystem, a true economy, and having multiple people building within Sovryn. And one of the other ways that we've discussed this is effectively creating the Bitcoin nation, right? A borderless nation governed by the rules, governed by immutable rules, transparent rules, and ultimately with Bitcoin as the high court. Now, where do we stand within this? I think we've convincingly achieved stage 1. So we've demonstrated the ability to do stage 1. We've built an ecosystem of Bitcoin native activity. We've had over 2.2 billion in trades and loans. TVL is about 6 times larger than our closest competitor, which is Stacks in our space. And we have the first ecosystem projects that have also been building with us. So I think that's one part of the context. The second part of the context is something that came up a lot in different forums, and particularly in the forum thread around this conversation, which is that the rootstock ecosystem is currently very limited and limiting. So rootstock has relatively low user interest, value deposited into the system. Most of that is driven by Sovryn, and as a result, we're not benefiting from a vibrant market and ecosystem, which is incredibly important for anyone who's looking to build a world on Bitcoin, anyone who's looking to build any kind of economy. And also something that I've experienced personally and others have as well, including, for example, projects like Babelfish and Money on Chain, Sovryn Financial, is in terms of the ability to develop partnerships and in particular raise investor funds. There's a huge amount of investor skepticism around rootstock and specifically RSK. So as a result, that it has and has been observed by multiple members of the community is currently a major limiting factor. And one of the things that we've heard again and again in different places and from different people is we need to get beyond the boundaries and the limitations of the current rootstock ecosystem. So what are the paths forward? So we'll discuss that, but on a very high level, in the immediate sense, there's been calls for additional utility for SOV. There's been calls to augment rootstock or replace it. In the medium term, there's been talk about building a platform or a rollup that developers are excited to build on, and then the long-term goal is trustless rollups or something similar like BIP 300. With that context, I'd like to open the conversation up, and maybe the best way to get this started is I'd be interested in, or maybe you guys can voice your initial thoughts or reactions on the basis of the conversation you've been seeing in the forum and the context I've just provided. So let's open the call up, please.
All right, everyone, this is your chance. If you have something to say, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. You can also type your question or comment in the open chat.
Hey guys, Hyde here. So I can only agree with that. What Iago said, it's a bit frustrating building on rootstock. Everything is happening quite slow here, and no, as not as most of us would like it to happen. And yeah, maybe it's about time to build something on our own. But I can imagine it will be quite demanding, and it will take also a lot of time and effort. So I think that we would need to carefully think of what we would like to build and how the backbone of this should look like.
Thank you very much, Hyde. Are there others who would like to comment, either to what Hyde has said or more generally?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a quick comment.
Sure, go ahead.
Thanks, England.
Sorry, if you guys can just say your name before speaking, so that we can all know who's speaking.
Rivers here, and I've just got a comment because I've come across the very same feeling that we're talking about Bitcoin layer 2s, and there's mentions of Lightning Network, of liquids, and RSK is kind of just silenced, and that nothing is being said about that. And I wonder, if this is just an RSK issue or like. What can we do? Because when we talk about, for example, projects that are built on liquid, like the Fuji Money or something else that would do a similar thing that Zero does, I'm sure that these guys are able to attract Bitcoiners, which we are struggling with. And I wonder if there's anything we could learn from that, or any reason why we should just say, well, Liquid will succeed in attracting Bitcoiners because XYZ, we will not because something else. I wonder if that's the case. Does anybody else have any feeling about that, any opinion on that?
Let me summarize that question as the question of target audience. I think we can come back to that. It is also addressed in the forum thread. I think Inglandia and David Soroy had things that they wanted to say. David, is that correct? You wanted to say something?
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So, what I struggle with is understanding how much of this is the sizzle versus the steak that, Yago always talks about, right? Is it the sizzle in the sense where we can create a new narrative and say, hey, we have this new chain or we have this roll up and that attracts buzz, which allows us to raise money? Or is it kind of like the steak where it's like, can we actually do this? And that's what I've struggled with most. Like I think the team, even Aurora and stuff will say, they're not blockchain developers. We're going to have to go out and find this team. So a lot of this conversation is kind of pointless to me if it's like, who cares if we create our own chain or we fork RSK or if we go to a roll-up. It's like, who the heck is going to build this thing for us? And so and that's a very, very difficult thing. Even if we have money, attracting good, competent devs specifically to build a chain or an L2 is very, very difficult. So if we're just concerned with the sizzle, then that conversation is kind of irrelevant. It's let's just go raise the money and figure it out. But if we're concerned with the stake of how can we actually do this, then I almost think we need to approach the question from the opposite direction and say, who are the smartest devs that we can possibly find? And then ask them, say, what is the chain or the solution that you ultimately want to build? And that's the question that nobody's ever been able to answer to me. It's like, who's building this?
Thank you, David. I think we can address that in two different places. One is, as we're talking about immediate versus medium versus long term, and then also when we talk about what execution is. So I think we'll definitely come back to that. Inglandia?
Yeah, I'm also curious what, if anybody here are users, what they honestly think from a user standpoint. I'm pretty satisfied with how Sovryn works. I mean, yes, there was some learning curve with understanding fast BTC and adding another RPC in the beginning, but after that, it just felt like another DeFi app. Maybe gas fees got a little higher with some of the smart contract transactions, but as a user, like I'm quite satisfied with how Sovryn works. I know from a dev perspective, it's like way more urgent to want to build on a more dev-friendly layer. So I was just curious, what other users here might be thinking.
Is there anyone who would like to respond to that in particular? Any other thoughts or comments? What I'm going to try and do in order to keep the conversation flowing is I'm going to try and elicit conversation here, summarize, and then try to keep us on some track towards the agenda. But ultimately, the goal is for us to have a conversation. So I'm just trying to facilitate that. Is there any other points that you guys would like to bring up, which we will add into the substance or the agenda?
Yeah, guys, feel this is a good chance to talk to the Sovryn team. We really need your feedback because it helps us determine the best direction to pursue to provide the best Bitcoin DeFi service possible. So, who love you, Blue? I don't know if you were typing something or felt like saying something.
Hey, yeah, what's going on, guys? It's Hula Hoop Blue here. Well, I guess just initial thoughts. If we're going to build another chain, like number one, if it's not better than the EVM, what is the point? Number two, well, I think it's a noble endeavor. But like, I think 4 or 5 years from now, we're going to have like AI optimized like base coding languages that could do an incredible job at like making another layer 2 or roll up or something like that. So I think it would have to be either modular or just easily adaptable, a really agile type system or something. And I just don't know anything like that that's being built right now. So I guess a third point would be things like IPFS. Like half the people well, not half the people, but a lot of the higher ups like Marco Vakalik and stuff, they're Bitcoin maxis. He wants Filecoin to be like basically a layer 2 on Bitcoin because he knows that the Ethereum network is centralized, and he's got a giant long paper about it. I think we need to do more to get that type of collaboration on these chains. I don't know why RSK hasn't completely just absorbed Filecoin like that already. So this is just my
Thank you very much, Ulubu. Actually, I would ask if you could please either DM me that link to that paper or place it in the forum thread. That would be very interesting because I think that's something I was unaware of and I'd be interested to look into. So
yeah, sure.
One of the things that has come up both in the forum thread in sort of Telegram and Discord and here is the idea of a sovereign chain. And I'd like to address that. I have a post in the thread in which I describe several paths forward. Now would be a good time, I think, to discuss that before going forward. So there are a number of different options of how Sovryn can achieve what I'm going to describe as two different goals. One goal is for us to be more deeply integrated with other ecosystems, to have more tooling available to developers, to have easier ability to interact with other protocols and to be part of a larger ecosystem and economy. So that's one goal. The second goal is the ability to increase and improve what Bitcoin can do, or what can be done with Bitcoin / BTC. Now, there's different approaches to this. And 4 approaches that I pointed out was, one, that we could build on ETH or something like ETH. So for example, you could imagine a roll-up optimized for Bitcoin with a Bitcoin peg, which rolls up to ETH, would be more integrated with the ETH ecosystem, would act as kind of like a bridge between Bitcoin and ETH. But ultimately would be secured primarily by ETH, although you could introduce aspects like anchoring and potentially proof of work to share in some of the benefits of Bitcoin proof of work security. So that's one option. There's obvious advantages to that. You'd immediately be part of a larger ecosystem. And there's also obvious disadvantages. For example, it doesn't achieve our second goal of building on Bitcoin, but it potentially helps us build more with BTC. And then there's also the question of whether or not this would be differentiated or interesting enough. And then from our perspective, there's also the question of whether or not we think this meets our goals as a community. And I suspect that it could be, the start of a civil war within Sovryn as to whether or not this is an approach we even want to take. Another approach would be to launch our own chain, which would not be a roll-up, it would be an independent chain. And maybe the cheapest way of doing that would be within the Cosmos ecosystem, and you could do quite a lot to tie Cosmos BFT consensus to Bitcoin blocks. In that case, Sovryn would be far more sovereign, but would rely on BFT and would be part of a larger ecosystem than currently are, but still much smaller than other ecosystems, but fast growing. In both of these cases, what I have suggested is there's a different approach here, which is if what we're trying to do is grow the user base, export sovereign dollars, and utilize what we've already built in other we don't necessarily need a chain or a roll-up, which is Sovryn, to do this. It could just be a suite of applications launched in these different ecosystems, something which I've sort of named so that we have a name for it, Sovryn X, right? Sovryn outside of the Sovryn platform. I don't think those achieve the building of a platform, but thinking about Sovryn X as a viable and relatively straightforward thing to do is something which I think we should at least engage with. Then option 3 and 4, which I describe, and bear in mind these are what I would consider very near-term things. We could do all of these within several months, assuming we were to make the decision and decide to take the risk of deploying a significant amount of our existing resources towards this. So one is a roll-up on rootstock. This would provide greater throughput, functionality improvements, potentially allow us to encourage other projects to develop, as well as things like perps, which we launched but were unable to run on rootstock. And because it's tied to the same chain that we are on now, it would be a relatively simple migration process for users and their funds. Disadvantages are multiple, and we can try. We can look to do an analysis of the pros and cons of these different things. And then there's option number 4, which is upgrade rootstock towards building a more significant platform. Now, the big distinction that I'd like to make here is we've got 2 different directions. One is taking the suite of applications that we have and bringing them to other ecosystems. That's Sovryn X. And the other direction is building out our own platform. To my view, and I'd be very interested to hear other views here, but to my view, the ultimate goal and the way to be thinking about what we should be doing is to be thinking about things through our long-term goal. And if our long-term goal is to bring trustless rollups to Bitcoin, in other words, have things directly rolling up to Bitcoin, what we should be looking to create are the tools to do that. And I'll draw out what a system like that might look like. I would expect that we would require a what I'm going to call a thin layer, right? A thin layer, which is a system which doesn't do very much, but it would contain the ability to have rollups rolling up to it. It would have the ability to have a two-way peg with Bitcoin, and it would have the ability to use Bitcoin proof of work as a security mechanism securing that chain. And then on top of that, you would be able to build additional, you'd be able to have rollups rolling up to that. If you have a system which allows rollups to roll up to that, you actually potentially have a great deal of flexibility. Each of those rollups could have different features, very specific or very general. You could imagine a system which is able to have an EVM rollup as well as, for example, a Rust rollup with different VMs. And what all of these different rollups would have is they would basically inherit the Bitcoin security that thin layer was inheriting. They would inherit the peg that the thin layer was providing, and they would additionally inherit a high degree of interoperability between themselves. And so on the medium term, that is what I think we should be looking to build. And in the long term, what we would be able to do is turn the thin layer into the layer which also trustlessly rolls up directly to Bitcoin. And then instead of having something like merge mining or other techniques to effectively import to the thin layer, and as a result of the entire ecosystem, the security benefits of Bitcoin proof of work, you would effectively extend Bitcoin proof of work into that entire system, and the entire system would be upgraded and inherit that together. Now, that's the medium and the short term. To get there, there's very significant questions about what we want to do now. But I think that those questions become easier if we, broadly speaking, agree on the direction of the medium and the long term. And I would like to address comments by both David and Huluvu. So Huluvu's comment was, one part of it was, I'm not sure I see the point if we're not introducing an improved VM or improved coding language an ecosystem. I disagree with that, because I think that what we're trying to do is not build the best smart contract system, but rather build a system which is flexible enough for Bitcoin to basically do anything. And basically open that gateway which allows developers to experiment with many different things. So I see the USP that we're looking to provide is to build on Bitcoin rather than to specify what people should be building on Bitcoin. And with regards to David Siroy's question, I think there is a lot of work out there by different parties, who most of whom have spoken to Sovryn, and to a great extent because of the ecosystem that we've built out and the flag that we fly, as well as the fact that John Light's paper has become the primary paper on rollups on Bitcoin, they have reached out to us, or we've been in conversation with them. And so this is not something I would see us doing alone, and I ultimately would like to move away from the that everything that Sovryn builds gets built sort of like by some kind of in-house core team, but rather in the correct way to do this would be to have an open source community built system, and then we would have different contributors contributing different pieces to this. Now, one way to achieve that would be to entice them, because they know that there's already an ecosystem that they would be building for, and a community that they would be building for, but also to help provide some subsidies and value. But I don't think that it means that we go out and hire developers. So that is a sort of trying to map out what our options are in the medium and long term. And what I would request is, if you guys, let's break this up into two different pieces. Let's put Sovryn X as an idea aside and maybe have a different conversation about it. And I'd like to understand whether or not there's agreement or disagreement around the medium and long-term goals. If there's, and so the easiest thing is to point out disagreements and or questions. Let's address them, and then we can focus in on the immediate or now.
Yago, can you clarify a bit on this thin layer concept? Like, technically, are you saying this would be a side chain that is merge bind to Bitcoin that perhaps acts as like a dedicated data availability layer with like an over collateralized ETC peg, and then the rollups are on top of that? I'm trying to understand the exact structure of this thin layer, like what it will and won't do.
Yeah, so I don't want to provide the exact structure, because the exact structure can be many different things. So, and to explain what I mean, one way that we could create this thin layer is actually by changing rootstock itself, right? So rootstock right now is not appropriate to be a thin layer. It's too heavy. It's got too much stuff going on it. What you would want, however, is something with the functionality, for example, of rootstock. In other words, it would have a peg, it would be EVM compatible, but would discourage developers from building directly on it, and probably have a significantly reduced state. So the primary requirements of what I would see as this thin layer is, one, it needs to have enough functionality, enough execution functionality to be able to act as a base layer for rollups. It's very probable that you would need it to be Turing complete, but not necessarily. It doesn't need to be a data availability layer. First of all, you can use Bitcoin itself as a data availability layer. And second, you could have an entirely separate layer as a data availability layer, right? So data availability is not one of the criteria. The two criteria are, one, it needs to be able to have, three criteria. One, it needs to be able to have rollups of different kinds roll up to it. Two, it needs to be able to be secured to convincingly by Bitcoin proof of work. And three, it needs to have a ultimately highly decentralized, federated, or preferably trustless peg. Now, you described one type of peg. There are many other peg designs that could be considered. But those are the base, the core things. And the reason I call it the thin layer is because you actually want to keep it doing, have it only do those things and nothing else. Did that help answer the question, David?
Yeah, I like it. I think it's intriguing.
Okay, so let me describe one path towards that. Actually, let me describe two completely different separate paths towards that to try and illuminate. Right, one path is we would work to make the changes to rootstock necessary to get us there. That could be, it could include things like making memory cost significantly higher, so that people don't want to actually run systems on rootstock. paring down the state so that most of the state is eliminated and doesn't need to be maintained by nodes anymore, and improving the peg, improving on PowPeg. We'd want to see greater decentralization. So one path is evolving rootstock towards that. Another path is saying, look, rootstock is its own thing. It's on, for whatever reason, we don't want to work with rootstock, and so we're going to basically start totally fresh. And there's multiple different architectures out there. One of the things that we've done with Sovryn is we've actually tried not to reinvent or invent technologies where possible. Where possible, we seek to use technologies that have already been validated. Sort of like Aurora's line that crypto is the testnet for Bitcoin. So there's plenty of tools out there that could potentially be used as a basis for a thin layer like this. Okay, so these architectural decisions are significant, and I think probably too deep for this conversation. There probably is a good reason to have additional conversations in the future. Any other comments, questions, objections to sort of what I've outlined? I'm particularly interested in people who sort of would disagree with this direction or think it's a waste of time or not something that we should be doing, or people who are confused or have questions, because I think that helps illustrate and illuminate the conversation. Okay, so well, let's assume for the sake of this conversation that there's a high degree of agreement on the medium and long-term goals. So then we get into this question of how do we get there? And so this is a question of execution. I've started to describe on this call some of the ways that we would get there. And I'd like to illustrate some of the dilemmas. So I'll start with consensus. Bitcoin proof of work is not trivially translatable to a different system today. There's multiple ways of trying to extend Bitcoin proof of work. So one is what we currently use, which is merge mining. This has disadvantages and advantages. One of the big advantages is that it is relatively easy to understand and is a straightforward access of existing proof of work security. But it has two very significant disadvantages that I'd like to point out. One is that it requires the miners who are participating to also be deeply aware and effectively acting as miners running full nodes of the thin layer, rootstock, whatever the other chain, whatever the merge mine chain is. Second is your security is reduced from Bitcoin proof of work security in two ways. First of all, you may only get a part of Bitcoin miners to merge mine the chain, which is exactly what we see with every single merge mine chain. And second, the cost of a attack on the merge mine chain is actually not equivalent to the proportion of proof of work. Even if you had 100% of proof of work, it would still be a lower level of security, at least under some circumstances, because it can be costless from. So let's say you're a Bitcoin miner, right? You make most of your money mining Bitcoin on main chain. You don't want to fuck up that revenue stream, but you can attack a side chain without impacting the revenue you make from your main business. And so in some ways it can be seen as costless to attack the other chain, at least in terms of Bitcoin main chain. So there are other methods as well. One is anchoring, and there is more and more sophisticated ways of anchoring. Another is roll-ups, which right now we don't have. There's a lot of work towards it, but this would probably be the best way. Another way is BIP 300 or drive chains. And then another path is some kind of hybrid system where you're using, for at least part of the security, you're using something like a proof of stake or a proof of stake time or something like that, plus a more sophisticated kind of anchoring. And so then what you're doing is you're using Bitcoin as the backstop to eliminate a lot of the potential risks that could come with proof of stake, as well as some of the centralization risks. Now, one of the topics that has come up in conversations like this within the community that I've noticed is a view that we should stick to merge mining, because that is what we're currently doing. I think there's potentially some status quo bias there, and at this and on the other extreme, sort of a very strict aversion to anything which would be proof of stake, which I don't necessarily agree with, but may be the right path forward, not just from a technical perspective, but also from a sort of branding or narrative perspective. I'll pause here for anyone who would like to ask a question, clarification, comment, or voice an opinion.
One question from Lectarius: How does Sovryn's financial position condition any or all of the described options, even blocking any or all of them? That's a really confusingly worded.
I think I understand the question. I think it's an excellent question. I think David asked a similar question, and I will come back to it. That is, I think, the next thing we should discuss. Any other comments before I move on? All right. So what I've outlined at this point is that, there's also decisions to be made around the consensus mechanism. And then the question that both David and Nectarius have asked is, who would build this? How would it be funded? And I think what that helps connect to is also the question of what actual design we would choose. So my view here is that we do not, that there is no one perfect solution. Definitely not in the medium term. I think in the long term, right now, trustless rollups looks like it's about as close to perfect as you can get, but we're not there yet. So there's many intermediate solutions. And because these are technical solutions, these are engineering problems, there's many different ways of achieving them. And so I think there's actually good reason not to be technology maximalists here. We do not need to decide how we're going to build it on the basis of technology, but rather on the basis of opportunity. And just to illuminate what I mean, cars today can work with batteries and can work with diesel and can work with benzene. Each have advantages and disadvantages, and each will get you from point A to point B. And so if we're just interested in getting from point A to point B, any of those techniques would work. Okay, so that brings us to a question of capital and talent. Now, there's a lot of teams out there, many who are very focused on Bitcoin, who are looking for, who are building out different types of solutions, and some of whom are not building specifically for the Bitcoin ecosystem, but are very interested in it. An example of them would be Celestia. Another example would be Starkware. And there are also many talented developers who are really interested in this who haven't found a way to contribute yet. My view on how we would go about achieving this And I think this will address the points brought up by David and Nectaris, as well as the question of how we would choose architecture, is as follows. I think that there's significant latitude for us to bring together different teams who are working on different parts of the solution. I haven't seen any team working on the full solution, or even properly having a full vision for the solution. But I think we have a vision for the solution and a high familiarity with the different teams that are working on different parts of this problem. I think there is an opportunity to bring them together and effectively create a community of developers who are developing towards a shared goal here. So that's in terms of the talent. I don't think that's going to be easy. I think it's going to be a question of having a strong enough vision that will attract these developers. We have like a vaguely strong proposition, but we haven't put forward a clear, we haven't flown the flag yet of this is what we're going to do. So there would be a need to identify them, to make sure that we have a cohesive group and get the work working together. Now, how would this be funded? Again, I don't think there's a simple solution here. So if we are a very well-funded project, maybe we just go out and acquire them, right? Another option is to create a prize for achieving this, and the prize can be broken up into the different components or modules that we'll be using. Additional options are for us to enter into sort of partnerships or business deals where developers are currently trying to build some part of this platform. They want to make sure that they have customers. They want to make sure that there are apps and users that are waiting for them on the other side, and that is something that we can offer. And then a fourth path is literally just sort of entering into some kind of services agreement. Not all of those paths require a initial outlay of capital. In other words, they could be near costless or costless for us in the absolute immediate term. And there's also some additional capital that may be necessary. And so to my mind, the way that we can achieve this is, one, we would need to fly the flag of doing this and really create a vision around building this that no one else is currently providing. Two, we would leverage the fact that we have an existing community which is growing, existing use cases which is growing, and significant value, to encourage people to accept our vision as credible and for them to see the Sovryn community as the place that is likely to get this done. Three, we would look to attract, where possible, without outlay of capital, this kind of work, and I think that's definitely possible. Before, we would potentially want to drive additional outlay of capital, and here too, I think just flying the flag can move us significantly forward on this path, because there is more excitement around building on Bitcoin now than there's probably ever been. There is a project which is clearly undervalued relative to other peer projects in terms of its value, and precisely because it is not a platform. And there is an exciting, important vision of where Bitcoin can go. I think if we are able to wrap all of those things under the banner of Sovryn, the ability for Sovryn to raise additional capital increases very, very significantly. There's no guarantee, but I think it changes where we are in terms of our ability to acquire and direct capital very, very significantly. And so I think that by putting out that kind of vision, and for us as a community agreeing on that vision, already gets us much, much closer to being able to begin to execute on that vision than where we are now. And that's one of the reasons why I think this is an important conversation. And I'd be interested in comments, questions, or people wanting to tear into that.
On was like, what do we do now? I think we have a lot of exciting implementations of some of our recent products brewing, and Sovryn Dollar is what, like a month and a half old. Um, I think we're still kind of exploring um, the potential of these new products, and um, it it might be a bit early to really move on anything. Honestly, for the next 6 to 9 months, that's just my opinion. It would be nice to see explore these, um, explore where Sovryn Dollar can reach in terms of other layer ones that are inquiring about it. There are apps being built on top of Zero, and these are really, really exciting things. So I think yes, rootstock is you know it may not be a forever thing with Sovryn, but I think it could be smart to just kind of wait and see how these products expand within Sovryn and outside of Sovryn. I think if we move on any sort of um, uh, new layer 2 development on Bitcoin, I think there's like um, a lot of ways or a lot of paths to take that could be I don't want to say wrong, um, but I just think that waiting and seeing for 6 to 9 months might be much safer than than going deep on any of the four paths that Iago mentioned anytime soon. That's just my thoughts.
Thank you, Glenda. Anyone else?
Yeah, hi again. I'm wondering if we have representation from RSK on this call, because maybe they could update us with some information.
It doesn't appear so.
I've actually been in touch with RSK and been trying to put together a combined working group to start exploring these different options and how we can collaborate together. To be honest, it's moving much slower than I would have hoped. But I am looking to do this in collaboration with them to the extent possible.
Thank you, Armando. So, are there other comments or questions?
Hi, Iago. This is Thomas. I'm just wondering, like, changing to a different chain or this new middle chain, how that affect everything that's already been built on rootstock?
Okay, I think that's a good question. And again, the answer somewhat is that it depends. But I'll give an example. One of the reasons why starting with a rollup on rootstock or an upgrade to rootstock could be beneficial is because it would allow us to migrate state, right? So Sovryn currently has a certain state. People have deposited funds. There's funds held within the various pools. One way to go about this is to start something totally new and then tell everyone to migrate. Another way to do this is to start something totally new and then forcibly migrate. And then there's a bunch of flavors in between all of that. So you don't need to necessarily forcefully migrate, but you can, whatever. I won't go into all of the nuances. But a third thing is that you actually upgrade the state itself. So it's almost as if, you've got the state which is sitting in this, let's call it the database, which is rootstock, and then instead of migrating all of the data to a new database, you actually upgrade the database itself. So the path that we choose, in part, probably wants to take into account the impact it will have on how easy it is for users and their funds to migrate, and for us to maintain a cohesive or unified system. That is one of those technical questions which there's multiple different solutions for, but that is sort of like the two flavors, right? Is migrating the database or migrating to a database. All right, so I'd like to also then maybe leverage Englandia's comment to provide a counter view. My view is that waiting is the worst thing that we could do, because I think there's already been a long period of sort of inclarity within Sovryn as to what is our ultimate plans for the Sovryn platform or the Sovryn layer. We, from very early on in the black paper, it was described as Sovryn looking to build itself as a platform. Rollups were described as sort of the citadel stage of Sovryn, the fourth stage of Sovryn. But we haven't unified as a community, as a project, around this goal. I think if we continue to wait and see, we suffer in two ways. One is we continue the ambiguity, which makes it difficult for us to be clear within ourselves and externally and cohesive around what it is that we're trying to achieve. Two is even more serious in my view, which is I think that Bitcoin is currently experiencing a very important moment. There is now the opportunity to define new modes of thought around Bitcoin, define new paths forward. There's a hunger for it, and I think there's a commercial opportunity for it. I think there's basically no project in the world which is as well positioned as Sovryn to do that. And I think it's basically our opportunity to lose, and the way that we would lose that opportunity is by not moving on it, not announcing that we're moving on it, and not beginning to raise the flag of building the next layer of functionality for Bitcoin. And so that's my counter view to Englandia's view.
Well, I think that there are also market considerations that we need to take into account. I think it's also, this kind of alludes to the point that David was mentioning about finding a team, and what Iago mentioned about teams that have reached out to us, that we could potentially collaborate with. I think it's very hard for us as a protocol to collaborate with external parties if it's not clear what our intentions are. And this collaboration, because it's such a large undertaking, has a lot of lead time. So putting things on hold for 6 to 8 months can potentially, given that, I'm assuming that the goal is to have a Sovryn have its own independent chain. Assuming that is our goal, then I tend to agree with Iago here that it gives us no advantage in waiting and only represents only puts us at a disadvantage. Also, in terms of the potential for raising funds for this endeavor, The sooner we get started, the sooner we can have an architecture, the sooner we can have deep conversations with potential partners, and the sooner we could be ready for when the market turns and funding becomes more readily available for these kinds of things. So maybe I don't understand. What are you suggesting to put on hold? Maybe I missed something. I think
would.
this will be the case regardless, because the development and architecture phase of a sovereign chain, or whatever it ends up being, is going to take that amount of time, if not more, if we start tomorrow.
I would. Listening to this conversation, I think I have an ask, something which I would ask you guys and ask the community, which is my belief is that it is time for us to evolve, to move to the next level of maturity and the next phase of Sovryn. I think we've built out the foundations and the proof points in terms of a base of users, a base of economic activity, and a suite of DeFi products. I think for us to get to the next stage, we need to move forward. And I would want us to be able to say this as a community. And so the ask that I have is, can we get to a point, or would I have the support of the community, and would the community join me in saying, look, all right, this is what we want to do. Let's be clear. We are planning to build a sovereign layer with the ultimate goal of having rollups directly to Bitcoin and allowing effectively everything to be built on Bitcoin, for us to build a world on Bitcoin, and for this to become a platform on which Sovryn and an ecosystem around Sovryn is building true economic activity with Bitcoin. I think as a community, I would like us to say that, and I'm asking whether or not the community, or the people on this call right now, would feel comfortable with us voicing in clear terms this intention.
This is one digit. I wanted to say one thing in response to that. It's hard for me to imagine anyone objecting to that as an ultimate goal, to have roll-ups on Bitcoin. Of course, we have no idea when or even if that can happen. So, the intermediate term plan is really important. And I feel like that we probably sort of an intermediate position here in the time frame is, I think we do need to move forward as quickly as we possibly can in whatever direction we're going to go. But at the same time, I'm not sure we have the consensus in the community for what that looks like. And I feel like that this call and the discussion on the forum are important steps in building that consensus, but I think we need more than this. We need first of all, we need a little more time, but also I think we need some written materials that lay out exactly what the options are. It's just really hard to process all this in a 1 hour phone call or reading through a forum. It needs to be, I think, something written in the form of a proposal. And I don't mean a proposal with exactly what's going to happen, but a proposal that says, here are the options. Here are what we perceive as the pros and cons. It might even be a living document where, we do our best to write down what the pros and cons are, and then we listen to the community, and then we update that. But something that we can study and get our heads around and take the time to really understand and realize, internalize all the pros and cons, and then try to go forward from there. But to do that in an aggressive way, I think would be important.
Thank you, One Digit. I mostly agree with you. So I think we absolutely need documentation. I think we definitely are going to have more conversation. I think for me in this call, the sort of ask or the primary question became more clear to me. And where I disagree with you is sort of trying to enumerate all of the options or trying to come to some kind of community consensus on the technical details. First of all, I don't think we're there yet. Second, I think that those things are often going to change. They're a question of R&D, and so and also I think that while I have a great deal of faith in Bitocracy to make decisions on the economic aspects and the security aspects of Sovryn, I don't really think that Bitocracy is an adequate forum or has the expertise to make technical decisions. My view is, and I think what's been clarified for me in this call, is that what I think we need to do is we need to have a shared goal. We need to make decisions on values and then allow that to become a space for developers to start proposing and offering the technical solutions, including the intermediary steps. And with regards to one comment that you made, that it may not be possible, I think that's fine. There's like a broad consensus within Bitcoin that we want to see Bitcoin become, the global base asset of the world. Whether or not that's possible or not is a separate question. I think, you can set out to win without knowing that you're definitely going to win.
I just want to add a little bit of perspective that maybe isn't always reflected on these community calls. There are members of the team now working to secure SOV listings on top-tier exchanges. Now, when you go through this process, these exchanges have committees and they examine the projects that apply for listing, and they look at many different things. One of the things is the overall category in which that project is playing. So it could be a DeFi app, it could be an exchange aggregator, it could be a layer 1 platform. They also look at the comparative projects based on that category. And I think this is an important example of why I personally think it's important that Sovryn as a community make an outward viewing decision around this. And that is because it has a lot of external value. When people today look at SOV, and again, I'm going back to the context of a listing committee at a top exchange, they're looking at Sovryn as a DApp, because that is what Sovryn presents itself right now, and the aspirations of the project are to provide certain financial services as a DeFi project. and it looks at the ecosystem in which it's operating. And that ecosystem currently is tied to RSK, over which the Sovryn community has limited control. And that gives them the framework in which they evaluate this project. And based on that evaluation, I think they come to the conclusion around certain limitations that the project can have in the future. And that directly impacts their decisions around listing. Now, this is, I think, true not only for exchanges, but also for investors who are evaluating a SOV token as an investment opportunity. And I think the value of Bitocracy coming out and saying that the aspirations are for Sovryn to be much more than a DApp, which means pursuing and exploring the ability for it to function on its own, within its own ecosystem and its own chain, have a lot of value. And I think the fact that if you look at the original black paper, it's mentioned that it's part of Sovryn's aspirations are to have an ecosystem, or what was coined an operating financial operating system. The intent there was to have independence of a chain, but it was kind of a footnote to the black paper, because the black paper first and foremost goal was to build out a DeFi ecosystem. Now that that's complete, I think it's important that Sovryn as a community state outwardly what its intentions are, so that outside eyes can evaluate it more accurately than they are today. So there's just 2 cents on kind of additional context that I think we need to take into account.
Thank you, Armando. Are there any additional comments, questions, concerns, or mini arguments that anyone would like to make at this point? Okay. Yes, Ingrid. No, I definitely think we don't, because we are already over time. So in that case, let me try to quickly summarize where I think we are with this conversation and what might be next steps. So I think a clear question came out of this conversation, which is, do we as a community want to clearly express our goals for the future? A second thing is, we described and discussed many of the current options, not in great detail, but also only a portion of the many of the massive design space that we could look at. And we discussed some of the paths forward in terms of building out a community of developers who would be working on this as part of the goal of achieving what someone wants to achieve. I think there is clear need for documentation describing what this could look like. We already have part of that documentation. I think the best documentation ever written around rollups for Bitcoin was written by John Light. And so we already have some significant documentation, but there's probably some additional documentation that we need or should look to. And I think we should look to move forward on making a decision as a community around our goals with regards to this matter. Some things that we didn't touch on. We didn't touch on something on creating additional utility for SOV. We didn't touch on Sovryn X. We didn't touch on some of the other topics that came around SOV utility in the thread, and I think we should have conversations on those points as well. And so what I will look to do is to try and summarize in the forum thread my thoughts or sort of what has emerged from here, and look to turn this into something actionable for us as a community. And in the meantime, I think we can look forward or should be looking to have additional conversations of this kind, look to come to more decisions on additional aspects. And most importantly, I think the conversation within the forum and here has been illuminating, and I'm glad you guys joined, and I'd encourage you to continue participating. For example, just saw that Martin joined. I don't know if he's been listening to the call for very long, but he completely orthogonal to this conversation. He mentioned some ideas around improvements to SOV or to staking, which I think are worth conversation. And those things which are elevated by us, I think collectively we're smarter if we contribute to the conversation. So thank you all for joining. I will add some thoughts to the thread in the forum. We'll keep it going, and I intend to try and move us as a community to a place where we're able to make a decision one way or another. So thank you very much, everyone. Stay sovereign. Yes, I think it would be well. Next week we have the community call, and I think we could add some of the topics to the community call. Well, I think, yeah, perfect.